And we are recording on Veterans Day, Tuesday, November 11th, 2025 at 2:03 p.m. Eastern Time with Mr. Garrett Graff and Mr. Richard Rhodes, who have both been on the show. I'm a fan of all of your works. I mean, first book I've read by Garrett was Raven Rock, is probably still my favorite book written to this day. And I think with Mr. Rhodes, I think I read Dark Sun before I read Making the Atomic Bomb. So
Ah,
I went backwards, but it was Mr. Graff's new book, The Devil Reached Towards the Sky. And this is what I was telling you beforehand. It's a lot like his book, The Only Plane in the Sky, about 9/11, in that it's all anecdotal evidence from that day. It's very easy to look back and say, oh, well, on 9/11, this happened. And at the time, though, the confusion and the fog really, you really
yeah.
see it as something different. And that's what he did with this book. But because I have the two experts on, yeah, I was gonna say, Mr. Graff, if you wanna start it. And for everybody listening, his book is in the description. Please go grab it on Audible.
So, thanks, Tommy. It's an honor to be back on the show, and especially to be talking to Richard Rhodes. This feels we may have both written books about the atomic bomb, but this feels a little bit more like a high school varsity quarterback getting to
Huh.
speak to Tom Brady for 45 minutes. Um, so this book, mine came out for the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings in August. And it, as you said, is an oral history that is meant to
Yeah,
try to capture the experiences of the people who worked on the bomb and the Manhattan Project sort of throughout the war, tracing the development and discovery of nuclear fission on up through ultimately the delivery of the bomb by the Enola Gay and boxcar on August 6th and August 9th to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the final chapter of World War II. And I think in some ways, I would hope it actually serves as a companion volume to the making of the atomic bomb, which I relied on deeply in my book and quoted, um, which I think sort of tells so much the story of the science and the scientists who worked on it. And I tried to zoom out a little bit
yeah,
more
yeah,
because I think in many ways, to me, the majesty and the magic of the Manhattan Project is in the story of the industrial might that the United States is able to bring to bear on this project. And there's this sort of great scene, which I'm sure Mr. Rhodes remembers, where Niels Bohr escapes Nazi Europe, comes to Los Alamos, and goes tearing down the hallway to see, I think it's Enrico Fermi, and
tell her.
Edward Teller, and
Yeah,
says, I always said you couldn't build a bomb without turning your whole country into a factory, and by God, that's what you've done here in the United States.
yes. No, I'm really glad that you expanded. I really had a lot of limitations, one of which was simply length. My book is 800 pages long. And to focus on the scientists was an important part of the story, largely because when I wrote that book, the documentation for the bomb program had just been declassified to the extent that it was. And that meant that all the previous books, such as Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, were based on interviews with participants. And by the time those interviews came around and the people could talk about what they'd done, they told their story so many times that the edges were all sanded off. And they often had dates wrong and names wrong. I was luckily able, because of the declassification of the documents, to tell the story reliably in terms of the actual support of the documents. And one of the pleasures of knowing some of these people was they're saying, I actually learned things from your book that I didn't know. So I think it was Emilio Segre who said that. the other advantage I had, of course, was that I could interview the actual human beings
Mhm.
themselves. And to the extent that I could spend time with them, get to know them a bit. But I was not able to cover the whole story. And I've had complaints ever since from letters from chemists who said, well, you told the physics version, but the real story was the chemical version,
Yeah.
and so forth. So I think there are room for more books. I have a friend who's a PhD physical chemist who's been trying to find a publisher for a version based on the chemical developments of the time. That would be a really interesting book, although he's having trouble finding a publisher because either they think it's too specific, to look too much just a part of the story, or they think the story is kind of old news, especially after the Oppenheimer movie. So,
Yeah.
so, so we each brought, I think, different strengths to the tale. But I'm very glad you brought in what to me is the glory of writing history, which is when I have real memories, first hand memories from living human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tommy, I think I've said this to you before when we've talked that to me the one of the reasons that I really like oral history and am attracted to it as a writing form and historical tradition is that I think it's valuable in terms of helping to put people back in the moments of big history without knowing the outcome. That I think it often sort of narrative history sort of starts with the decision that people make and then sort of follows the downstream consequences. And oral history and interviewing people, I think, is so valuable in helping to put you back in the mindset of what they were thinking and sort of how they made their decisions and what what they were thinking and what was influencing them at these moments when they were sort of standing at the crux of history. I think one of the things that's just so fascinating to me, and across all of your work, Mr. Rhodes, you've done so much to, probably actually more than any other living American to help inform the country about the sort of history of our nuclear enterprise and history. Um, but I think what is so fascinating about the entire arc of America's nuclear system, from the Manhattan Project on to where we are today, and we're talking here in November as Catherine Bigelow's nuclear movie House of Dynamite is the #1 movie on Netflix. That so many people across these last 80 years have known a slice of America's nuclear history and sort of known a slice of the truth of, how nuclear weapons came to be and how they are operated and how they might be used in a conflict. And there are so few people who have ever actually known, if anyone ever has, sort of the full story of America's nuclear enterprise and history. That there's sort of so much that is still classified about how nuclear weapons might be used, what their exact capabilities are, what what our sort of delivery systems, could launch. Um, and I think you have done such a fascinating job across so many books now, from Making of the Atomic Bomb to Dark Sun to Arsenals of Folly and beyond, to trace that evolution across 80
Mhm.
years. And yet, I'm always struck by how much of this story we still don't really know today.
Right, right. And a lot of it is pretty dark in that, I mean, to take two examples, the number of near nuclear accidents, so called, that might have led to some kind of full scale nuclear winter scale exchange uh, is still pretty much not out there. I know there are lists. I know people have published scholarly papers, but the general sense that somehow this is all under superb control as some of the people at Los Alamos said, designed by geniuses to be handled by idiots. I mean, they certainly did try to do that, especially where interlock systems were concerned, so that these things couldn't go off because someone assembled something wrong or whatever. Uh, the other side, and one that has really had almost nothing written about it, but that fascinates me, is Bohr's essential dilemma, which was beautifully summed up in one sentence that he said to a colleague of his. We are in an entirely new situation that cannot be resolved by war. Over and over again, the effort of the government, while purporting to be interested in deterrence as the primary function of our nuclear arsenal, has basically tried to find a way to make the weapons usable. And it has consistently been by organizing the understanding of them in such a way that their real destructive power is presented as far more minimal than in fact it is. I noticed this you may have come across a book by a Stanford scholar uh, about the tendency of the military to focus entirely on the blast effects of nuclear weapons, when in fact they're, first of all and primarily, weapons of fire, weapons of, and of course radioactivity as well, but primarily they're big fire bombs. And she explores that. The rationale on the military's part has been, as it was at the beginning, more realistically with conventional firebombing, that once in a while you could cause a firestorm, but they depend on weather conditions. She shows very clearly that nuclear weapon explosions don't depend on weather conditions. They make their own damn weather, right? They create tornado-like funnels, chimney-like funnels that draw in air from the outside and burn up everything in sight. I always use the example of if you exploded a 300 kiloton weapon above the Pentagon, if you only counted the blast, it would take out everything in the immediate downtown area up to and around the Capitol. But if you count the fire effect, it would take out everything all the way out to the route that surrounds the entire city of Washington. That's a dramatic difference and a horrible difference because it would basically burn up everything. So the attempt has been, and I think it's very dangerous, to somehow believe that nuclear weapons can be used, when in fact all the evidence indicates that it's to the contrary. That needs to be said and that needs to be explored, and it has not been. Maybe it would be hard to do because it would get into all sorts of security problems, to be sure.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think you get it in there. What to me is actually one of the most interesting aspects of the sort of looking back at the way that nuclear weapons have been thought about and controlled in the United States, which is the presidential sole launch authority
Uh,
across the last 80 years has actually more often than not been the check on the use of nuclear weapons. That while we, I think, often today think of sort of the insanity of the idea of the president being the one person who can sort of decide on his own at any given time to launch nuclear weapons anywhere in the world against anyone.
and that's our
That
current president, especially.
exactly that actually when you look back at Eisenhower and Kennedy and others, that it's often been them sort of sitting there in that position of ultimate authority and vetoing the use of nuclear weapons that has been recommended to them by their military leaders.
Exactly.
And this in some ways I think was part of how Harry Truman sort of set up that sole authority in the first place. And Alex Wellerstein has a new book coming out about that sort of decision and process next month that I'm really looking forward to. But, you know, Eisenhower is the one sitting in those meetings saying, you know, guys, you don't understand. This is not just like any other weapon. You know, if we actually use these things, there are not enough bulldozers in the country to shovel the bodies off the streets. And, you know, it's Kennedy in the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis who goes around the table in his XCOM meeting and gets, you know, near unanimous, if not unanimous, you know, suggestions to use nuclear weapons and invade Cuba. And, you know, he then stands in front of that room and says, you know, I vote nay and the nays have it. You know, sort of, there's only one vote that matters and it's mine. And no, we're not doing this. This is insane. And I think that is, as you said, I think anyone who looks at our nuclear history across 80 years realizes that we have avoided nuclear war much more through luck than by skill or strategy.
Right. The Able Archer 1983 was one of the signal examples of that, when our actions were so inadvertently threatening to Andropov, I guess, the former head of the KGB, who was at that time the premier, that he actually had planes warming up on the ground in East Germany, loaded with nuclear weapons, presumably tactical, but I don't know. But again and again, you see that pattern. And you normally see one rational human being standing between us and Armageddon. It's just terrifying when you think about it, as I have many times, especially under present conditions. And I don't mean just Donald Trump. I mean also Vladimir Putin. Putin has invented a new way to use a nuclear threat that I think is really scary, which is to make a nuclear threat umbrella under which he can conduct conventional war. That's a new one that was only started originally in 1999 and 1998 by India and Pakistan, when Pakistan got something like that going in their fighting over the borders between the two countries. And then I guess someone realized what an interesting game it could be. So we're playing at a different and more narrow margined challenge than used to be the case. So I go back always to Bohr. First, it scares me, these things, and then I think, wait a minute, this is really what Bohr meant. He basically meant that you could take on the nation state, one of the most toxic organisms ever invented, despite its virtues, and make it back off and make it have to stop and find a way through. And what's scary is that nobody really has quite come to that point yet. And I think that's partly interrelated to the downsizing of the actual destructive force of our real arsenals. The very fact that we built so many of these stupid things. You know, the Chinese, for the first 20 years after they got the bomb, I think they had 6 ICBMs. They were following a theory by a British scientist, right, who said basically, look, you don't need a lot of these things to have deterrence. 1 or 2 are more than enough. And it saved them a lot of money, saved them a lot of developmental time, and it worked just as well. Now, because they also realize that there's a prestige factor in the number of weapons that a country has, they're enlarging their arsenal. And everybody's saying, oh my God, what are they planning? They're not planning anything other than to have more bombs. since that seems to be the checkers on the checkerboard these days. The Indian uh, minister of the Indian Secretary of Defense equivalent, Minister of Defense, said when they first tested their bombs in 98, now the big boys will have to let us sit at the table.
Yeah.
So there it was.
Yeah. I worked on a piece actually earlier this year for Politico about sort of the wars of the next 10 years and sort of what geopolitical experts worry about. And I think we feel, I think too often we feel right now that nuclear war is some artifact of the past. And as you point to, I think it is a much closer part of our daily existence today than most people realize. I mean, as we look back over this year, we've seen open conflict between India and Pakistan, the two largest nuclear arsenals ever to come into open, armed, sustained conflict. We've seen the U.S. and Israeli raids on the Iranian nuclear program. We've seen saber rattling between the U.S. and Russia, and Donald Trump threatening to move nuclear submarines around the world to sort of better threaten Russia. I think that this is something that is a much bigger part of our daily life than most people realize. I'm realizing sort of as we're talking, I don't know, Mr. Rhodes, how did you ever get interested in this topic in the first place? How did this become sort of you as a writer have such a broad and wide range of history that you've tackled in journalism, and yet I think that this has become sort of one of the few continuous threads of your whole writing career.
Yeah. Well, two different lines that led together, I think. One was I went through a period of severe abuse as a child, partial starvation and physical abuse and so forth. And it basically set me on the course of writing about human violence in all its various forms. I mean, I wrote a book about the SS Einsatzgruppen a few years ago, after which my agent said, well, you better write something cheerful for a change, or you may not find a publisher. But the Einsatzgruppen was just one little piece of that giant question about human beings and the way they mistreat each other. So that was one line that has, I think, affected pretty much most of my subjects of writing. But the other was was making my living all through the 60s and 70s and early 80s as a magazine writer. I was turning out 10 pieces for national magazines a year just to support myself, and it was madness trying to work up a new subject every month. But I, at some point, got interested in Robert Oppenheimer, and I wrote a profile of him for a magazine that no longer exists. But that got me curious about the whole larger subject. And then, as I said, just fortuitously, just about the time I was starting to think there was a book there, the Atomic Energy Commission, or its successor, declassified an absolute warehouse. I mean, literally a warehouse full of documents. You know how much there is.
Yeah.
You can get buried in them forever. So much so that when I went to Washington to work at the National Archives, there was no way I could go through all the documents even that were there physically. I used General Groves' selection of documents that he made for his personal history of his part in the Manhattan Project. And that was more than enough to write. And then, of course, added to that the science part. But the fortuity of being able to finally tell the story from the point of view of the documentation and to back up all the oral histories that I was collecting at the time or looking at. There were a lot already in the books, of course. But it was those things coming together, really, plus my deep interest in human violence and how you prevent it and how you live through it and how you perhaps get around to stopping it from starting in the first place that I think provided the emotional motive force for this huge story. Because after all, what did those people think? They were building a weapon of mass destruction. And I mean, people ask me that, and I'm sure ask you every time you talk about your book. But it's easy enough to say, well, they were afraid Germany would get there first. And that certainly was the motivation through the early part. And I think one can explain the use of the weapons on the Japanese as well, although that was partly, I think, a technical consequence of the fact that area bombing didn't really do much other than destroy a lot of civilians. But here they were ready to go, and here was maybe a way to stop the war early. And I think now, with the revelations by the Japanese American historian, who has been able to read both the Russian and the Japanese and the American documentation, it wasn't finally the bombs that ended the war. It was the invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union at the end of the war, which, to be sure, was partly driven by the fact that Stalin realized we really did have such bombs. So those are the reasons I got into it. But I mean, I always tell people 200 of the most interesting human beings of the 20th century. How could you not want to write about them? And they left such beautiful records behind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really does seem like that, sort of the other end of the pendulum swing, where I started off talking about that I think sometimes we over-focus the story of the Manhattan Project on Robert Oppenheimer and his band of merry physicists in Los Alamos. The sort of other end of that pendulum swing is, I think you're exactly right, it is the, probably greatest gathering of human intellectual talent potentially in history and potentially anything that we could ever imagine going forward. Because I think it was such a fascinating moment. I think you see now all of this writing and theorizing about how science is slowing down because there's now so much science to know going forward. And you look at someone like Fermi, and
yeah.
sort of Fermi knew more about more things in 1940 than any human could know today about the world. The sort of their level of intellect was so outsized compared to sort of the known universe of the time.
And Fermi, especially the last combination theoretician and experimentalist who could actually do both and do both at a first-class level. Yeah. No, Fermi is a wonderful character, by the way. He was so frustrated that he couldn't, as you know, that he couldn't speak English without an accent.
Yes.
It just drove him crazy. He kept trying to learn. And he was so sort of driven in an almost mechanical way. He had the same problem at Los Alamos. Well, not a problem. They used to have square dances on Saturday night. And Fermi didn't know how to square dance. So he stood and watched for any number of Saturday nights until he knew he had it. And then he'd go out and take over the floor. And someone said later, well, he was a little mechanical. Well, of course he was. I have a story to tell you. That if I had one lucky edge over you, it was that these people were still alive.
Yeah.
Some of them, not all of them, but I could go and actually meet them. But one story I'd love to tell because it was so amazing. I interviewed George Kistiakowsky about 3 months before he died. He had cancer when I interviewed him. And during the interview, I guess he must have been on a course of chemotherapy because he would get up and go into the John and I would hear him throw up. And then he'd come back as if nothing had happened and sit down and talk some more. He was a tall, raw-boned, giant hands Cossack who had actually ridden horses and fought the Red Army as a White Army guy in the Russian Revolution, and then come over here and became an expert in shaped charges. Really pioneered that whole field. But so I asked him about a story I'd heard that he had handled the blocks of explosive a few nights before they went down to Trinity. Uh, the implosion system, just for the audience, I'll say, was a bunch of blocks of high explosive that turned with the detonator at the outside point, this spherical arrangement that turned an expansion of a shockwave from the point of detonation around so that it was directed inward toward a point, from going outward to inward. And good God, how do you do that? He figured out how to do that. But he was concerned because it was very important that the compression of the plutonium ball be symmetrical. Otherwise, you just squirt it out the way when you're playing with water in a swimming pool, you can squirt water out of your hands. So he was worried that there might be bubbles in this waxy matrix of high explosive, which was heated and poured into a mold to make these various shapes of blocks. He was worried there might have been bubbles in them and that the bubbles might distort the implosion. So he said, what I did was I stayed up all night one night, a few days before we moved down to Trinity, and I took a 50-pound block of high explosive and I x-rayed it. And if I saw a bubble in it, I would put it on my lap and take a dental drill and drill down through the explosive to where the bubble was. And then I had a pot of liquid high explosive on the fire and I would pour that in to fill the bubble.
Oh my
And
God.
thus I eliminated all the bubbles. And I said, Dr. Kistiakowsky, weren't you afraid that 50-pound block of high explosive would go off in your lap? And he slammed the table with this giant hand of his, knocked my tape recorder onto the floor, and said, 50 pounds of high explosive go off in your lap. You wouldn't know it. It was just, oh my God, it was such a wonderful moment. I've never forgotten it.
Yeah.
Just to have this physical presence there. But we take what we can get when we're writing history, of course. And I think you're expanding the story. I'd like to know who were the people who really impressed you outside of Los Alamos.
So
Let me just say, I wrote an essay once that began, Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project is fading into history. Eventually, it's going to be one man, Robert Oppenheimer, one place, Los Alamos, and one bomb, Hiroshima. So you have that larger story.
Yeah. There were a couple that really stood out for me. First, on Kistiakowsky, going back to what I was saying, I mean, that's an incredible story. I can't even imagine sort of the joy that would have come from actually meeting him and interviewing him. But going back to what I was talking about, how some of the power of those original interviews and oral histories is in how people don't know the outcome of the thing that they're working on. You know, one of the quotes that I ended up putting in the book from Kistiakowsky that I just loved was how annoyed he was to get dispatched to the Manhattan Project in the first place, because he was working on this sort of incredibly important, explosives lab, and thought the Manhattan Project was sort of a scientific dead end, that he thought that there was sort of no way that we would get an atomic bomb that would, on any sort of timetable that would impact the outcome of the war. And, he wanted to sort of wake up every day and be helping to shorten the war. And they sort of saw this whole effort as like, oh, got to go help those weirdos out in Los Alamos. Like, I want nothing to do with this. But I think for me, there were a couple of people that really stood out. One being, again, for all of the attention that Oppenheimer gets, I think most of it sort of rightly so, I think one of the heroes of the whole effort is Arthur Holly Compton, the University of Chicago professor who really is the driving force behind the sort of first year of the Manhattan Project, and getting off the ground what we now call the Manhattan Project, and the way that
Yeah.
he sort of builds that first team of scientists. He's actually the one who recruits Oppenheimer to come into the project in the first place. Drives the effort to build that first chain reaction in the old squash court underneath the football stadium at the
Right.
University of Chicago. And his memoir is just one of the like great science memoirs of all time. I mean, it's sort of rollicking, and he's got a great voice, and sort of fascinating, insights into the personalities that he was working with. And then I think the other person who really stood out for me was was Paul Tibbets, who I think
Uh,
we, in this sort of shorthand that you're talking about, that we sort of tell history by. You're like, oh, Paul Tibbets, the pilot of Enola Gay,
yeah.
and what you come to understand with Tibbets is that he's not sort of like a semi-random Air Force pilot who happens
Uh,
to be assigned the atomic bomb mission in the summer of 45, that he is really, one of, if not perhaps the best bomber pilot in the U.S. military in
right.
World War II, and goes off, has this incredible career in Europe, then comes back and is assigned the effort to sort of start the training program for the B-29, the super fortress that's going to bring the war home to Japan. And I tell the story in the book, which is sort of one of my favorite, rabbit holes in the story. And as you only have so much space even in a very long book, and so sort of there are only so many little digressions and rabbit holes you're ever able to follow. But one of my favorites was that Tibbet sort of steps into this B-29 program at this moment when this giant Boeing bomber is still filled with gremlins coming off the assembly line, and it's getting a reputation for being hard to fly and finicky, and the men who are being trained to fly it are starting to sort of balk at being assigned to the B-29. And so Paul Tibbets goes down to Florida and finds two WASPs, the women air service pilots, and trains them over the course of a couple of days to fly the B-29, and then has them fly across the country to each of the bases where the B-29 pilots are being trained. And when this giant B-29 comes in and lands and these two women pop out of the cockpit, it turns out there are no longer any men on the base who will admit to being too scared to fly the B-29. And that in the course of like 10 days, Paul Tibbets like turns around the whole B-29 program, because he sort of sufficiently embarrasses all of these, brave, male pilots. And
That's a
then
great story.
Incredible.
and then from there basically goes and is asked to set up what we now call the 509th Bomb Composite Group, which is this unit that is the one that is equipped with these silver plate B-29 bombers to drop the bombs on to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. And that he's like 29 years old when
Yeah.
he gets
Oh, yeah.
this job.
And do you remember what they called him? The old bull.
Yes.
Oh man, yeah.
These were babies. Vonnegut famously called I think the subtitle to his book on the bombing of Dresden was The Children's Crusade.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
because he was only 18 or 19, Paul Newman was a friend of mine, and he was flying over there and was one of the guys who came back and said, thank God for the atomic bomb. But Paul was only 19, I think, at most.
Yeah.
Had been trained as a Navy bombardier for the invasion of Japan.
Yeah. And then, Paul Tibbets builds this 1,000-person, effectively standalone Air Force that, they figure out how to drop the atomic bomb, this bomb that is larger and bigger and more complex than any bomb they've ever uh, been trained to drop. They practice these incredible maneuvers of this 155-degree turn that the bombers have to make as soon as they drop the bomb so that they get far enough away that they survive. And that this whole enterprise really rests on Tibbets's
Yeah,
shoulders, for those final 9 months as this comes together. And in that story of Paul Newman, you actually captured what to me has been one of the most interesting interactions I've had with readers since the book came out,
oh,
which is, I think, we talk now with 80 years distance about the moral choices of dropping the bomb as if they're sort of much more straightforward than they felt to anyone at the time.
absolutely.
Um, the number of people who have come up to me at readings, and I'm sure you had this too, who, say, I'm here because they dropped the atomic bomb.
Yeah,
My dad was going to be in the first wave of the invasion of Japan, or, my
My
dad
my
was.
dad's dad was going to be he was 18. He was going to be. Yeah, it makes it clear. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. No, I mean that's exactly it. It's been remarkable to me realizing sort of how many Americans have this sort of deep sense of family history that, like, my family is here today
yeah,
because the atomic bomb was dropped and we didn't invade Japan.
yeah. And of course, there was a whole revisionist movement for a while in the historical community arguing that it wasn't necessary. The Japanese were ready to surrender, la di da. And I think again the Japanese Americans book really put paid to that theory, made it very clear that Stalin was stalling the Japanese delegation that had gone to Russia to hope to get Russia to intercede, which it was still neutral in the Eastern War because weren't ready to fight that front yet, having really basically fought the war in Europe. We didn't get there till 44. Uh, he makes it very clear that the bomb had their part and that the bombs had their part, particularly with the emperor, who realized the whole country was going to be bombed out. I found a memorandum, speaking of being able to get to the documents, found a memorandum from Oppenheimer to Groves dated around the 10th of August, saying if we can build composite cores for our Fat Man design, both plutonium and uranium, we should be able to turn out 6 bombs a month by October. And you think about what 6 bombs a month, the next target was going to be the Japanese railway system. They were going to make sure the food could not be delivered to the people. So I always point out it wasn't just Americans who were saved by the bomb. It was the Japanese civilian population too, the ones who weren't killed by the bomb.
Yeah. I
Mm.
think that was the war plans for the initial invasion, Olympic and Coronet, I think had 9 atomic bombs as part of the war plans. That they were going to be 3 landings, and they were
Oh,
going to use 3 bombs per landing site, to sort of knock out the beaches, knock out the assembled defenses behind the beaches, and then to knock out, and then sort of a third bomb that would drop a day or two after,
oh,
to hit the assembling defensive efforts. But to your point, I mean, the idea of that the next phase of this was not going to be, two bombs. It was going to be,
Many
two
bombs.
bombs every couple of
Yeah,
days kind of thing.
yeah, yeah. Well, and the idea that we would expend all that money and all that effort for to send a message to Stalin is just so patently absurd. I've never understood why anybody argued it, except that there's a strain in historical writing that's very anti-American, unfortunately. Yeah, or maybe fortunately. We need that too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's I was gonna say just as a side quote, talking about the bugs and the B-29. I think it was the quote in Garrett's book. I think it was LeMay said there's more bugs in it than the entomology department.
Yes.
I was at the gym and I started laughing. Yeah, that was like that was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I think just the very idea when they're going into it towards the end. I know this is like not the most like intellectual takeaway, but I think you have all these stories after it of all these guys younger than me, and they go, that was on VJ day, that was the only day I've ever thrown up from a hangover.
Yes.
And like I know it sounds simple, but I'm like that kind of set. You have these dudes who, 18 are taking out Okinawa. Like these guys they're not weaklings, and they're going, that's the worst day I ever had. I'm like that says something. That
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
says
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
Well, and then there's a Kistakowski story there as well, that is out at Los Alamos on I think it's on August 6th. I think it's the not VJ Day, but the day of the bomb is dropped, and that they have a huge party in Los Alamos to celebrate the bomb dropping. And he gets so drunk that he goes out and checks, opens up the high explosive shed and gets out what he thinks is 21 charges to do a 21 gun salute, but he's drunk, and so it ends up being 22 that he sort of fires off in the desert there, and then goes back to his room and his apartment on the mesa, and passes out and wakes up the next morning, and his colleagues have built a wall of bottles and cans up the front
Yes.
of his door, so he can't get out of his apartment again.
Yeah, I think yeah, and those are again, I think those make it a little more human than like most things. It makes it because again, the fact that Tibbets goes and does that with the Wasps, or also what you're talking about is you have everyone going and working all day, putting in long shifts,
Yeah.
and then the African Americans have to go to their own
Yeah.
much worse conditions.
That's true.
And when you hear that, you go, oh, that really was a long time ago. It's very
Yeah.
easy to go, oh, nuclear weapons, very advanced, and you hear that and you're like, that, oh wow, that really
Yeah.
was. So kind of both those things, that the alcohol, but I mean, yeah, kind of using the women as intimidation almost, as well as, and we're doing this work side by side, and then it's like the black guy's like, hey, you got to go to this little shed. You got like what, like 10 beds in this little tiny hut. That does, I think, put it into perspective at it was not at all the same time we live in now, which I know is an obvious statement, but I mean truly, it's you get a feeling of just how long ago it was.
Yeah.
I was 8 years old in 1945, and one of the things that we were missing, we children, all through the war, was bubble gum. There was no bubble gum because the chicle is a tropical product, and for whatever reason they couldn't get it. I remember that we would chew street asphalt just to have something to chew. You would think it would have made us sick, but it was better than nothing. And whatever else we could find that was chewable. But my brother and I both, I had an older brother who I grew up with, both welcomed the day when bubblegum came back and had a contest to see how many pieces we could chew simultaneously. These were cylinders of bubblegum that was about the size of oh my God, what? A large lima bean, only rounder. So it was quite a bit of gum. to see who could get the most pieces in and still blow a bubble. And my brother beat me out. He chewed 22 pieces of gum. He had a sore jaw for days afterwards, as did I. But, the other thing, though, being a child in the Second World War was a very strange business. We lived in a boarding house. My mother had died when I was a baby. My father and I and my brother lived in a boarding house that was run by a German couple. He had been a prisoner of war in the First World War. And probably for that reason, they still spoke German in the kitchen and between and among themselves. Probably for that reason, we were very focused on the Pacific War, not the European War. So, and it really looked like a damn dicey business, both wars, both fronts, until around 43.
Mm-hmm.
There was not much sense that, we were really worried we were going to lose, particularly that the Germans would win in Europe and take over. And we should have been afraid. I later on, writing about the Einsatzgruppen, found a document that said that after we finish off the Jews in Europe, we can do all the Jews in England, and then we can take all the Jews in America. They had a number like 20 million for the number of Jews that they intended to kill. That was the real war for Germany. Anyway, it was a wonderful time in a way because the streets were empty of cars. You couldn't get tires, you couldn't get gasoline. They were both rationed. So not very many people drove very much. Mostly people used public transportation. And we could play in the streets. The milk and bread, which had been delivered by truck, were now delivered again by horse-drawn wagons that had been restored by the milk and by the dairy and bread companies to have a way to get the deliveries done. And we loved the horses. We were fascinated with the horses. But in every window, in every block, in at least one window, there was a black velvet flag, a pennant with a gold star on it, which meant someone in that house had been killed in the war. Some father, some brother, some son, as combatants in the war. So there was this strange sense of darkness and evil in the world, and at the same time, this kind of particularly delightful childhood going on at the same time. I'm sure that was another influence. I know that when the bombs dropped, I was fascinated with the science as an 8-year-old and became interested in science at that point in my life. So that was another feed into my ending up writing about this subject.
Yeah. That's amazing. And I think rings true in my research to talking about the communities where the bomb was being built. That Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is one of the two secret cities where the U.S. Carves this enormous community out of effectively the wilderness.
Yeah.
Oak Ridge and Hanford, Washington, Hanford being the plutonium site, Oak Ridge, the uranium site. They're each supporting about 100,000 people by the end of the war. Communities that didn't exist at all. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, this is one of my favorite statistics, has on August 6, 1945, the day that the Manhattan Project is announced to the world, the bus system serving Oak Ridge is one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States.
Amazing.
And it serves a community that no one knows exists and that doesn't appear on any maps. And it's a community where much of the workforce was women because, all the men, as you're saying, are away fighting the war. And there's this sort of great scene in 42, 43, when the war really was feeling a much more close run thing than we now, I think it to be. I think we have a sense of inevitability about the Allied victory today in World War II that was not apparent to most of the people, not reflective of how most people thought about the war from, 39 to 43-ish. Where the Tennessee Eastman, which is the company that the U.S. government brings in to run the Oak Ridge factories, is trying to figure out who they can get to staff these thousands of positions that they need to run the uranium refining machines, which are called calutrons. And Tennessee Eastman says basically we're going to hire high school girls out of rural Tennessee, and all the Berkeley PhDs
Oh,
who
yeah.
are working at that say, there's no way we can teach a girl how to run a uranium machine. And Tennessee Eastman ends up setting up this head-to-head contest between the uranium, the Calutron girls, as they come to be known, and the Berkeley PhDs. And the Calutron girls outperform the Berkeley PhDs. And almost all of them learn the word uranium for the first time on August 6, 1945. They spend their
Oh,
entire
yeah.
war
Yeah.
running these calutrons without any idea what the machine actually does and what the thing is that comes out the other side.
Right. Groves famously used a system called compartmentalization to make sure nobody knew more than they needed to know for their specific job. So these women were basically watching a needle on a big dial and keeping it within a certain set of limits. They got very good at it. The other thing that I like very much about this was true both at Los Alamos and at Oak Ridge, and no doubt was also true at Hanford. But they had, let's see, what was the court? They had these courts during the day. Oh, they were tennis courts. They were concrete floored tennis courts that were poured for recreation at Oak Ridge. But at night, they would take down the nets and they would have dances. And then people as someone told me, we spent the whole decade of the 1930s bored out of our minds. We didn't have any money. We couldn't go to the movies. We just had to stay home and suffer. And so when everybody got to these places, they took down the nets at night and had dances, and there were a lot of babies made in the bushes around. And the same thing was true at Los Alamos. General Groves had, you remember, such a problem with the wives of the families getting pregnant that he finally ordered Oppenheimer to put a stop to it. The other thing I wanted to mention is something I may have heard this from Hans Bethe, actually, of all people. At Los Alamos, there was, as there was everywhere, a real, what's the word I want? A real difference between the number of women and the number of men. And there were a lot of young men working there who had been graduate students, who'd been dragged in and were still single. And there was a real problem with they're not having any sexual outlet. So they were sleeping with the secretaries when they could, but it was all and some of the secretaries were charging. So, I mean, why not? so, so the town council, which was mostly sophisticated Europeans, of course, they were the scientists, Bethe among them, he said, we had a closed door meeting and we just decided that we would formalize this a little bit. And we set it up, a payment schedule in certain places so they basically opened a whorehouse at Los Alamos to provide for the understandable needs of the staff on both sides, the women and the men,
That's
which is not one of the stories most people have heard, must
Yeah.
still be classified.
I think that's astounding. I mean, it's funny, but that's astounding, especially just thinking about like the social norms of the time,
Yeah.
and that was waived, and it's like that kind of goes back to how important this thing was.
Well,
Like we
yeah,
we
but
will yeah.
it's also true that these were sophisticated Europeans planning all of this and trying to provide for everybody. So
Yeah.
I know. Well, you think about the comfort women who were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese and so forth. This was a somewhat more civilized arrangement whereby the the secretaries made some money on the side. I'm sure their pay was low because the pay was determined by what you had been earning before you came to Los Alamos. So graduate students didn't get very much, and others got more.
Yeah.
Um, uh, if we're coming up to an hour, but and I'd love to do this again with you guys. But I was gonna say, and this is just kind of more wild speculation, and I have a biology degree. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but it does both of your books, and especially yours, Mr. Graff, just kind of about the confusion at the time. It does make you wonder about what is going on right now in the pursuit of both AGI and or ASI and whether or not it's even
Mm.
possible. But again, in terms of that mad rush to the finish, we have to build this before Germany does. I mean, you can see the same idea again, kind of being floated before China does. Um, and not only, and you have to turn the entire United States into a factory, and like by God, you've done it.
Yeah,
Then with, compartmentalization and it remains classified, and even you're right, Harry Truman, you talk about this in Raven Rock. He's like, where's all this money and power going to Tennessee? And they're like, hey, don't shut up. You kind of wonder, your imagination can start to run wild, and you in 2025, how many of these things are? What
yeah.
we're building a ton of nuclear power, or we want to build nuclear power plants. I mean, Amazon and Microsoft are like renting them privately. Man, I know my head starts spinning in terms of it's an event horizon of a new weapon that no one knows its capacity, and everyone's fearful of someone else getting it, and we've shown that we can do it. I'm just kind of an open-ended question to both of you. If do y'all's imagination ever go there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been talking about in sort of all of my book talks as I've been out there for these last couple of months is I think we part of what we misunderstand about the Manhattan Project and its historical legacy is thinking of the legacy of the Manhattan Project as the bomb itself. Whereas what it really was, and you see this across sort of all of the books that Mr. Rhodes has written sort of since also on the nuclear enterprise, is the Manhattan Project, along with efforts at MIT's Rad Lab to develop radar and the proximity fuse and sort of all of the other things that Vannevar Bush was doing, um, gave America a whole new way to think about the relationship between government and higher education and science and technology as a core source of national strength. That sort of
Yeah.
a big part of the first 500 pages of your book and the first chunk of my book is the you know European refugee scientists coming to the United States and sort of pounding on every government door that they can find to say, hey, we should build this atomic bomb thing. And like, we don't want Germany to get it first. And the American government and the American military is sort of saying, like, we don't want anything to do with this. Like, we're interested in like, figuring out how to build better bullets. Um, and that what the Manhattan Project does is just transform our understanding of science and technology as sort of the core source of American economic strength and innovation and sort of the whole post war enterprise, that I think delivers us 50 years of amazing technological advances and economic prosperity in the United States. And when I think about this modern moment with AI, the thing that really concerns me is that we are dismantling very actively right now the exact system that the Manhattan Project gave us in terms of government funded research, in
Hmm.
terms of grants from places like NIH, grants from places like DARPA, um, the waves of immigrant technological talent that we
Sure.
have invited to our shores, the modern day equivalents of Fermi and Kostakowski and
Yeah.
Teller and all the rest of them. And I really worry a lot that sort of right on the cusp of these new technological breakthroughs, like we are letting other countries catch up and take the lead on how to invest and innovate in technology.
Yes, the barbarians are at the gates. Absolutely. Um, a story that I think illustrates something of what we're talking about. When I get a royalty check on the making of the atomic bomb every 6 months, and it's pretty much a roughly standard amount each time because I guess the book is used in a certain number of courses. So that number is kind of automatic. All of a sudden, a couple of years ago, one of the royalty checks was 5 times what it normally was. And I couldn't figure it out. And then I sort of sniffed around and talked to people and realized Silicon Valley's guys, or whatever is the equivalent these days with AI, San Francisco maybe, had decided there was a parallel with the Manhattan Project. And they'd all gone out. I envisioned them as buying my book as a kind of talisman. Maybe they read it, I don't know. But suddenly there was this boom in this book. I thought it might be the Oppenheimer movie, but it was well before that came out.
Hmm.
And then the next 6 month period, back to normal. So everyone who wanted to buy a copy bought one. But they were looking at this parallel. And I've read lately a couple of papers that make very clear this is not just some new software, although that's very dramatic and effective. It's a new industrial enterprise on a national scale. Bohr's comment to Teller, 20% of US electricity by the end of this decade, or soon after, maybe 2035, is expected to be taken up just by all the server farms. 20%. No wonder they're going out and buying small nuclear reactors to power them because there's not that much electricity around, you know. The rest of us need it as well. But that indicates, and these server farms are huge industrial enterprises of their own. They're largely automated, to be sure, but they're big machines, basically. So I don't know that I'll be around. I'm 88 years old. I probably won't be around to see the ultimate transformations, but I hope I can live at least until my 100th birthday in 2037 to see what's going to happen here, because something is going to be radically transformed. I don't know if you use chat. I do every day to bypass and collate all the various separate research sources that are around when you're writing history. And it's just superb.
Mm-hmm.
It makes mistakes. You have to make sure it gives you a reference and all those things. But the moral panic that's around the use of AI fascinates me too. It seems to have disappeared for the bomb, unfortunately. That's a moral panic perhaps we should have. But in the meantime, everyone's so busy putting down AI that I'm not sure they're looking at its upside.
There's an article I'll send you both that I read last summer that kind of influenced what I just brought up, and it's called Situational Awareness by Leopold Aschenbrenner. And it
I'm
starts
reading that right
Oh,
now.
you are? It
I'm
starts
reading it
just
now.
with that. It starts with
Yeah,
the power. It's less about the server farms and it's more about power contracts.
yeah,
And you go, wow. And it's what does he say? Every couple months they add another zero to the size of the cluster.
Yep.
It's a
right.
million, it's 100 million, it's 100 trillion. And you do and the important, I think my takeaway is some people yes, it's coming, it's AGI, it's ASI, it's inevitable, it's an event horizon of human growth. The other side says no, it's just a dumb thinking machine, it's not real. I think the most important part is people with money and power, and more specifically governments with money and power, think it's real
Yeah,
and they're
right,
pursuing it. Whether or not the
right.
A bomb is possible, we thought it was, and that is fascinating. And I think
And
that's what's fascinating.
and you're right, because what they understood was we had to have this.
Yes.
And so did the Soviet Union, so did every other major world power feel the same way. We must have this. It's just going to be absolutely necessary, or we'll be off the stage.
Yep.
Um,
And I would add one really
Good.
interesting distinction there, which is when we were building and harnessing nuclear power, there was a clear understanding that those atomic weapons would be the sole purview of the government,
Yeah.
and that you wouldn't have Lockheed Martin building its own nuclear arsenal and then Raytheon building its own nuclear arsenal, and then the government sort of could ask to use parts of Raytheon's arsenal and Lockheed's arsenal, but it is meaningfully distinct in this moment
Yeah.
that you have this sort of advancing technology being developed entirely by and for and in the private sector outside of any nation state structure, and that these companies will end up with sort of nation state powers and capabilities that are not necessarily beholden to a nation state in the way that we are sort of traditionally used to.
And I think
Um,
you could feel the rumbling of that going on
And
under the floor, as it were,
yeah.
I was gonna say,
within those companies and their struggles
a-
together.
as you go further in that article, and I know it's a long read. He talks about just that, and I think he used that exact analogy. He's like, there wasn't an A bomb being developed by Boeing and EG&G. He talks about all these things are happening, and not only will the industrial might kind of need it to all be focused on one thing, kind of like the explosive lenses, but he also goes, you're going to see like you're going to see the nature of power come out, and you're going to
Yeah.
see someone in the government go, you just straight up, I don't want Microsoft having that. And they are going to say this needs to be a nation state, whether or not it needs to be through funding or whether it's just, we don't want 10 different corporations with their own arsenals. It's hairy. It's hairy, yeah.
I've always argued that corporations were basically like brown dwarf stars. They never quite got going to thermonuclear burning. They don't have an army and a navy, but otherwise they're very much
They're yeah,
like medieval empires.
100%.
Each, yeah. So now they get weapons. Oh my God!
That's where it's seemingly going.
Well, there's always a new subject to write about.
Well, yeah, I mean, it
That's for sure.
certainly never ends. And for everybody listening, I mean, I cannot recommend it enough. Please go into the description. Please go grab Mr. Graff's book. It's The Devil Reached Towards the Sky, and it's terrifying and it's fascinating. And of course, Mr. Rhodes is The Making of the Atomic Bomb. But guys, I would love to do this again. I'll put you guys in touch after this, and I can't thank you enough for both of you coming on here. It really was a treat for me. So thank you for that.
Well, Mr. Rhodes, I will go ahead and pencil me in for 2037 and that 100th birthday, and we can reprise this conversation to talk about all of the AI advances that have happened since.
And the robots that are now doing our laundry and our dishes. Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely.
It's a
That's
cheery
the other thing we
it's a
need.
it's a cheery future. Gentlemen,
Good.
Mr. Richard Rhodes, Mr. Garrett Graff, thank you both so much for your time. I'm a fanboy of both of you guys, so it's an absolute treat for me. So thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
All
My
right,
pleasure.
guys.
This was such an honor. Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Thank you for watching.